The first man who saw her unloading iron sheets from the wagon said she'd gone mad from grief. By the time the second man passed and noticed she wasn't using logs but stacking curved sheets like armor plates around a square timber frame, he said she was trying to build a steam engine and didn't know it. The third laughed to her face, said a woman like her didn't need a home at all, just a patch of dirt and a preacher. Then the wind started blowing sharp out of the canyon, and the frost rolled down like the breath of death itself. And every one of those men came knocking, but by then the steel walls were already warm. Her name was Norah Bell, 37 and widowed twice, once by a fever that took her husband in the spring, and once more by the laughter that followed when she dared stay on the land alone. Her last name was his, but the land was hers, a half-mile patch along the dry bend where the cottonwoods thinned. No children, no kin, and no interest in joining the other settlers who clustered their cabins closer to the creek by the edge of town. Norah didn't want their pity, their glances, or their advice. What she wanted was to survive the winter. The joke began the morning the first wagon load of rusted steel arrived. Curved ribs from an old Quonset hut the railroad had scrapped after a flood down near Santa Fe. She'd paid $10 and traded her only milking goat to get it hauled north. It was the ugliest heap anyone had ever seen on homesteader land. Strips of dented metal, half twisted from age, some even blackened from past lightning strikes. Norah took them anyway, not just for their shape, but for what they could hold. Heat. Not one soul had built a steel cabin before, and she knew it. But she remembered something her first husband once told her, kneeling by the rusting boiler in their ruined barn. Metal sweats in summer, but in winter it holds the fire like a secret. She remembered that secret, and she intended to make it hers. The men in town were split. Some laughed loud, others quiet. A few watched the horizon where the first snow clouds had begun to gather. The high pass had already frozen over. It was only October. Still, when Norah dug the trench for her foundation, hands blistered and raw from frostbite scars she refused to show, she did it with a kind of silence that unsettled folks. No crying, no swearing, no drama, just a woman with steel in her eyes to match what she was hauling on her back. She built low, just 1 story tall, but the walls were double. First a layer of heavy logs, the same as anyone else might use, then steel sheeting, hammered in tight, then bolted down with salvaged engine parts from the trading post. She packed clay between the layers, insulated with horsehair and burlap, built her chimney not straight up but curved sideways into a wind-drawn tunnel, a trick she'd learned from watching prairie dogs survive February when grown men froze, solid in their beds. Inside, there was no grandeur, just one room, split in two with a thick curtain, one side for sleeping, one for fire and food. No windows, just a trapdoor vent above the stove, and a small porthole she'd salvaged from a train caboose mounted in the east wall to watch the sunrise. No one understood it, and no one tried. When the first hard freeze came, 3 of the newer settlers lost their wells. The frost line had dropped fast. One of them, the Halley boy, only 17, lost 2 fingers trying to cut wood before dawn. Folks began burning furniture. One woman even gutted her own chicken coop just to keep her baby warm. But Norah, she didn't step outside once for 2 whole days. And when she did, to fetch a bucket of snow to melt, steam poured out the door behind her. That was the first time the laughter stopped. Then came the storm. It rolled down from the divide with a fury no one expected that early. Sheets of white, sleet like thrown nails, and a wind that split fence posts down the grain. Trees cracked, livestock panicked, chimneys blew smoke backward, and the new cabins, the ones built quick and tall with gaps between the logs and poorly sealed joints, began to fail. One by one they grew cold. You couldn't fix it with just more wood. Not when the air inside turned wet and heavy and never warmed, no matter how loud the fire roared. Babies got sick. The Davis girl came down with croup. The storekeeper's wife fainted twice trying to cook by a frozen hearth. The Morgan family lost their pantry. Every last jar cracked, every potato gone black. But from the ridgeline, just barely in view, a faint orange glow flickered through the steel porthole of the widow's home. Someone said it looked like a lantern. Another said it looked like heaven. Norah didn't invite anyone, not at first. She watched the storm through the glass, rocking slow in her father's old chair. Her hands were wrapped in oiled rags. Her breath barely misted the air. The walls held it all in. Heat from the small cast-iron stove, body warmth, the trapped layers in the floorboards and steel shell. Even the curtain, thick with quilted flour sacks, kept the air perfectly divided. It wasn't luxury, but it was survival, and that meant everything. Then came the knock. It was slow, hesitant, not a bang, a thud. Norah stared at the door, didn't move. Another knock came, then a third, then a voice, hoarse and thin through the wind. "Miss Bell, my girl's freezing. We lost the chimney. We just need a place to hold her for the night." It was Reverend Owens, the same man who once told her a woman without a husband was like a gate without a fence. He stood outside with a bundle in his arms. His daughter, no older than 10, soaked through and shaking like a leaf. Norah didn't speak. She opened the door, stepped aside. He didn't say thank you, just cried when the heat hit his face. By dawn, there were 4 more families waiting. The cabin fit 11 that week. Norah never said a word about the mockery, never scolded, never reminded. She shared her fire, her stockpile of beans, her dry burlap floor. The stove ran full for 5 straight days, and still the walls held the warmth. One of the children pressed his face to the steel and said it felt like the sun. By the 7th day, a rumor had spread through town that her home was enchanted. Some blamed witchcraft. Others claimed she'd made a deal with a Navajo spirit. But the school teacher, who had once mocked her openly, simply stared at the steel walls and said, "God help us, it works." But not everyone was ready to accept it, and not every secret of the cabin had yet been revealed. By the end of the 2nd week, word had spread as far as the depot 2 towns over. A woman, some said witch, some said widow, had built a steel cabin in the hills and packed it with heat like a furnace. Folks who'd laughed now whispered. Folks who'd scoffed now begged for her recipe. Even the sheriff came knocking one morning with frost around his hat brim and apologies in his eyes. But Norah was no miracle worker, and she'd built her home for one. The storm hadn't broken, it had only deepened. The wind carved hollows through the snowbanks like great riverbeds of white. Smoke rose low and crooked across the town, and every board of every wooden cabin groaned as the cold crept deeper into every nail and joint. Babies coughed blood, elders slept and didn't wake, and even the mayor's 2-story house, built from the finest imported pine, had ice blooming across the ceilings like frost flowers in a tomb. Only one home still glowed warm on the hill. Inside, Norah barely slept. Her old chair was now the only seat not taken by a child. The Reverend's daughter lay bundled beneath her late husband's army coat. A baby from the Higgins family nursed quietly in the heat, no longer blue in the fingers. The stove never dimmed. Norah fed it from her hidden stock, wood she'd cured in a dry pit behind the cabin all summer, wrapped in oilcloth and cedar bark, never once exposed to the rain. The others offered to help. They took turns melting snow, clearing the stovepipe vent, standing watch at night. One man, Clive Morgan, who'd once bet she wouldn't last a week alone, tried to fix the leaky joint in her stovepipe with a piece of his belt. When it snapped, he broke into tears, blaming the cold, the wind, his own pride. Norah didn't speak much, but her eyes softened. Outside, things were growing desperate. The general store had been stripped. The meat hooks were empty. Rabbits had vanished, burrows hidden under ice. The creek had frozen nearly solid, a thing that hadn't happened in 10 winters, and one man broke his leg trying to crack through it with a crowbar. The wind began carrying voices, screams. One night they heard someone wandering blind through the drifts, calling a child's name. Another night, 3 men came up the ridge with fire in their eyes, armed with axes and desperate hunger. They didn't knock, they tried the door. Norah had built more than just walls. She'd forged the hinges from scrap iron and welded the seams with melted tin and soot. The door handle turned, but the frame held like a vault. When the first man swung the axe, it rang like a church bell. The second blow dented steel but split the wooden haft. By the third, they were yelling curses, sobbing, kicking with frozen boots. Inside, the children screamed, the baby wailed, the women clutched iron skillets and fire pokers. One man reached for Norah's hunting rifle, but she raised her hand and shook her head. She didn't need it. Instead, she crossed to the fire, took a shovel from the coals, and opened the chimney vent wider. Within seconds, smoke poured out the stovepipe, thick and dark as pitch. Outside, the men coughing turned to retch. The cold turned it sticky, tar-like, clinging. One of them slipped, fell, and crawled away screaming that the house had demons. They never returned. By morning, the storm had buried the cabin halfway to the roofline. Inside, it was still 64 degrees. The days blurred. Weeks passed. The baby began crawling. Norah started marking the wooden beam above the fire with chalk notches, one for each sunrise the fire still held. 13, 14, 20. Outside, the town began to hollow. Higgins' cabin collapsed under ice. The Jensen boys were found frozen around their hearth. The sheriff's office burned when someone knocked over a lantern trying to melt snow for tea. Those who could fled down the canyon on mules, barely able to breathe through the frost. Others huddled under tarps and barns, praying for spring. But some, the ones who had once mocked the loudest, couldn't bear the shame of knocking now, and they died with pride clutched in their blue fists. It was late January when The creaking started. At first it came from the back wall, a sound like a slow stretch, metal shifting under pressure. Norah knew it wasn't the stove. The pressure valve had been checked twice that morning. No, this was something else, a weakness. The rear wall had been the hardest to build. The curve of the steel had warped from its original train yard form, and she'd had to brace it using old wagon springs, bolted crooked into the floor joists. It had held, until now. The frost was shifting. Ice had wedged itself between the outer shell and the log layer beneath, and as the wind pressed harder, the metal began to bow. By nightfall, there was a hairline split, a sliver of pale air slicing through the shadows, breathing cold into the warmth like a whisper. Norah stared at it for an hour. Then she stood up, took off her shawl, and began taking apart her father's old chair. The repair wasn't elegant. She had to rip the stove curtain in half, wrap it around the inside, seam, and hammer a wedge of cedar planks into place. She used every nail left in her drawer, even tore the binding off her Bible to use the leather cord as a brace. It held, barely. When she sat down, her hands were bleeding. Her breath wheezed. One of the boys came to wrap her wrists, but she waved him off. "I didn't build this for comfort," she whispered. "I built it to last." But nothing lasts forever, and something was still coming. The final storm hit in mid-February, a wall of wind so thick it stripped bark from trees and flung shingles into the air like leaves. It came with lightning, black snow, and a pressure drop so violent it popped ears and cracked cellar walls. Town records would later call it the deep freeze of '82, but Norah Bell would remember it as the moment the steel sang. That night the porthole glowed like a star. Inside, the fire roared so hot they had to dampen it twice just to keep the air from scorching. The stove groaned, pipes rattled, and yet the steel cabin, battered, patched, dented and frostbitten, held its shape. The heat stayed, the children slept, and the widow, wrapped in her husband's coat, sat by the vent and watched the wind scream past like the devil himself clawing for entry. He never got in. When the snow finally stopped, there was no more laughter, only silence. Then came the thaw, and with it, the reckoning. The snow didn't melt so much as it retreated, like a defeated army leaving the dead behind. It took 3 full days of sunlight before the banks sagged and slid in sheets from rooftops, knocking chimneys askew and burying whatever was still standing. Drifts cracked in the woods, trees groaned under shifting weight, and down by the creek, the ice broke with a sound like a gunshot. When it cleared, so did the air, sharp and strange and almost too bright to look at. Color returned, not warmth, not yet, but the blue of the sky began to push out the gray. On the ridge, Norah Bell stood, at the top of her snow tunnel, her battered steel porthole behind her shoulder. The wind was gone. The stillness was not peace, it was the kind that follows a death. Below her, the valley lay changed. The town had lost 13 people, a baby, 2 elders, 3 trappers who'd tried to ride out for help, a woman and her teenage son, found curled around each other in their cabin. No fire, the glass on their oil lamp frozen solid. The worst was the schoolhouse, collapsed overnight under snow weight. The teacher had lived. The 3 children sleeping on cots inside hadn't. No one had laughed in weeks. Not since the second storm. Not since the steel cabin had kept its glow. They didn't laugh now either, when Norah came walking into town with her coat singed at the hem and frostbite on 2 fingers from hauling water in the final hours of the freeze. They stared, mumbled. One man dropped his gaze and removed his hat, but nobody said a thing until she passed the general store. There, standing beside the cracked porch railing, was Wallace Boone, the carpenter who'd once said her cabin looked like a smelted soup can nailed to a fire pit. He looked up from the ground, eyes sunken. His beard was trimmed short now, not for neatness, but because his wife had died and he no longer cared to hide his face. "You built it for yourself," he said, voice low. "But it saved everyone who went in." Norah didn't answer. She didn't need to. He nodded once and added, "We want to learn how." That was when the questions began. By the end of the week, a circle of townsfolk had climbed the ridge to inspect the cabin, not intrusively, not with noise or disrespect. They came like pilgrims, slow and cautious, notebooks in hand, brows furrowed with hope. Norah showed them the steel walls, the double insulation, the clay-stuffed joints, the earth-sunken base that kept the floor above frost line. She explained the stove placement, not in the center, like most homes, but angled toward the sleeping half of the room, with the flue doubled back on itself to keep heat longer. She showed them the curtain divider, stitched from burlap sacks, the vent that could be sealed with a twist of bone and twine, even the trapdoor in the floor, a hidden crawl space she'd dug as a last resort, where warmth pooled lowest. It wasn't magic, it was effort, ingenuity, a kind of planning the frontier rarely allowed, because grief and hunger and noise usually got in the way. But Norah had lived in silence, and silence had given her the time to think of everything. The sheriff brought lumber, the reverend brought his son, the widow Jones, who'd once turned her back at church when Norah passed, brought 2 sacks of nails and a peace offering in the form of dried apples and 3 jars of plum preserves. One by one, they began to copy her cabin, but it wasn't as easy as copying shapes. They learned the hard way. Boone's first attempt warped in the thaw. The steel buckled where he hadn't reinforced it with inner beams. The stove smoke backed up. His wife, already coughing, took worse. They begged for help. Norah came down herself. She bent the steel back with a length of timber, braced it with stone and hay, then showed Boone how to shape vent curves with a shovel and wet burlap, a trick she'd learned watching the wind. He didn't speak a word the whole time, but when she left, he wept where he stood. Others came to her now too, not with questions, but confessions. Old McKellar, who'd once thrown stones near her porch to scare off her chickens, brought his daughter, pale and sickly, and asked if she could learn how to build for herself. Norah gave her a tin cup of warm milk and a piece of chalk and showed her how to mark the wall with heat gradients, a trick to know where to insulate thicker. Even the banker's widow arrived, bonnet wilted and shoes torn, asking if her grandson could sleep on Norah's floor one more night until their own chimney was fixed. Norah said yes, but her eyes were different now, tired, not resentful, but watchful, wary. She'd been alone for so long, and now she wasn't. But kindness had a cost, and the thaw wasn't done revealing what lay underneath. In March, the creek flooded. The snowmelt surged faster than anyone guessed. Old bridges cracked. The Higgins cabin, what was left of it, was swept downriver in a sheet of ice. The path into town washed out. More people came up the ridge, not for heat this time, but for height. By the 4th week of melt, 5 more families had pitched tents near her cabin. Children ran barefoot between the trees. Someone built a latrine. Another strung up clotheslines. A makeshift village formed, not out of celebration, but desperation. They'd lost too much down below, and Norah's cabin was the only proof a home could survive the cold. But she hadn't built a town. She'd built a sanctuary, and it was cracking under weight. The first time someone stole from her, it was eggs. 3 gone from her coop. The hen left frightened, her nest trampled. She found the shells half buried near the tree line, still warm. A child, maybe, or worse, someone who hadn't asked. She said nothing. The second time it was kindling. A whole bundle vanished from under her porch. She found the footprints, big ones, a man's. They circled the woodpile, then the door, then the stove vent. She followed them halfway down the slope, then lost them in the pine duff. That time, she said something. She left a note on her door. It read, "Take, and I will close it." The fire dimmed. Not because she ran out of wood, she hadn't, but because something had changed. The steel walls felt tighter, the air thinner. Her hands ached not just from work, but from a kind of weariness that came from being watched. She was no longer a recluse. She was a beacon, and beacons don't get to choose who comes to the light. Then came the rain. Late April. The melt had slowed. The creek returned to its muddy banks. A soft warmth crept into the soil. Green returned, tentatively, but with the thaw came a new threat. Rust. The steel had endured the snow, the wind, the cold, but now it faced its oldest enemy, time. Small orange flecks began to bloom along the seams. Where Norah had bent the panels thin, water found its way in. Where bolts had cracked, the joints loosened. Even the stovepipe base, once sealed with tin and clay, hissed when rain hit, tiny trails of steam rising like signals. Norah worked furiously. She repatched the seams with pitch, painted the outer wall with oil, dug drainage trenches to keep water from pooling. But it wasn't enough, not alone. One morning Boone came with a brush and a bucket of grease. Didn't ask, just started painting the lower walls. Others followed. The Reverend's son carried stones to bolster the foundation. The Jones boy brought new hinges. Even the banker's widow came with sandpaper, smoothing the rust from the east wall, as if she were polishing an altar. They worked without praise, without talk, and Norah, watching from the doorway, realized something she hadn't dared hope for. They weren't just copying her, they were preserving her. Still, the question remained, what now? The storms would return, if not this year, then the next. And steel, even if treated, couldn't last forever in this land. Would she rebuild? Would she teach others to do it better? Or would they simply wait for the next miracle woman to build the next impossible home? Norah didn't have answers, but she had plans, and under her bed, wrapped in a canvas sack stitched shut with wire and sinew, was a drawing, a blueprint, not just for one cabin, but for 10, laid in a circle, each with steel-reinforced walls, clay-sealed seams, and shared chimneys to feed communal fires. A plan for warmth not as a secret but as a bond. She hadn't dared show it. But now, Now she was ready, because she'd seen what happened when you built a fire and let others in. You didn't lose the heat, you multiplied it. The day Norah unrolled the blueprint, the wind carried no bite. It was a rare morning, not just for the weather, which had softened to a steady spring breeze, but for the way the people stood. Normally the hill was silent, the town cautious around her cabin like it was sacred, but now they came closer, no longer with hats in hands, no longer just as students or survivors, but as neighbors who understood what they owed. The steel cabin had given them a second winter's chance. Now they wanted to make sure there'd be a third. Norah laid the plan across the stump she used for splitting kindling. Her hands moved slow, not for drama, but because the parchment was old, worn from being unrolled and rolled again in secret 100 times. The lines were faded, ink scratched in shaky hands, but everything was there. 10 cabins, built low and tight in a crescent around a central trench line that doubled as both drainage and communal firewood store. Shared chimneys, staggered steel plating, a central windbreak wall, and at the heart of it all, a gathering room, circular with a vented roof, modeled after an old sheep hut her first husband had built with Navajo help near the Red Mesa. It was brilliant, but it was more than that. It was survivable. It was hope cast in steel and soot. The people looked at it like they were staring into a warm room through a window. Then the questions came. What if the wind shifts different next time? Where do we find that much steel again? Can it be done before the next freeze? How do we build the chimneys shared but separate? What if someone builds wrong and the smoke backs into another home? What happens when someone decides they don't want to share heat? Norah answered each one, not all with words, some with nods, some with small movements of her hand across the blueprint, where she had drawn wind arrows and pressure gaps and elevation lines so faint only she seemed to know what they meant. And then she spoke the one sentence no one expected. You don't have to copy it exactly, but you do have to do it together. The words hung in the air, not heavy, just unfamiliar. Together. It had never been that kind of town. They began with the foundation, not of stone or clay, but of agreement. Boone and the Reverend mapped out who would dig where. Jones and her 2 sons went hunting for scrap steel, not just in town, but in the burned wreckage of barns, the ruins of a derailed freight car out by Cedar Hollow, and even the old mining shaft where dynamite crates had once been lined with iron sheeting. Norah helped sort. She knew the shapes she needed, not flat, but curved, dented, things that could be braced into place and sealed tightly when packed with the right combination of clay, oil, and time. Some men questioned her about the circular gathering room, said it looked like Indian stuff, said it might be better to square things off and keep it tidy. Norah didn't argue. She just walked them to the vent tunnel behind her cabin, where the curved wall had kept smoke low and warmth tight even during the worst nights. You want math? She said. Circles trap heat, angles lose it. They nodded. That was enough. By May, the ridge had become a work site. Children were hauling straw. Old men bent nails straight with river stones. Women melted pine sap over cook fires to seal gaps in the new chimneys. Every morning began with the ring of steel on steel, and every night ended with stories traded by the old porthole window, which Norah had agreed to leave open so the children could pretend to peek into the future. One of them, a girl named Maybeth, who hadn't spoken in months after losing her parents in the freeze, drew a picture in the dirt one morning, a long shape with flames inside and people standing around it holding hands. "It's your cabin," she said quietly. "But more of them." Norah stared for a moment, then bent down and handed her a small stub of charcoal from the stove. "Draw them bigger," she said. It wasn't easy. Nothing good ever is. Boone cut his hand bracing a beam and nearly lost 2 fingers to infection before Norah poured honey on the wound and wrapped it with boiled cloth. The Reverend's son fell from a roof and cracked his collarbone. The banker's widow collapsed from heat stroke in June, trying to haul iron in a wool coat because she had no idea what else to wear around laborers. But they kept going because they remembered the cold. And more than that, they remembered how it felt to see warmth behind a steel wall and not be able to reach it. That memory drove them harder than any preacher or mayor ever had. By midsummer, 7 cabins stood, none as fine as Norah's, but close, each one tucked into the slope, braced with logs and curved steel, flanked by a shared chimney stack connected through a zigzag flue Norah had invented herself, one that allowed smoke to rise from multiple stoves without backing up into the wrong home. The trench was lined with stone now. The gathering room's frame was up, a circle of thick timbers, bent in a spiral like wagon ribs, wrapped in oil canvas and braced with rawhide lashings. Norah slept less, ate less, her hands blistered and cracked, and the cough she'd carried since the thaw began to rattle worse when she climbed stairs. But she never stopped. Then came the fire, not in the cabins, in the valley. July. Lightning struck the edge of the Jones property. The old barn, dry from rot, packed with hay, went up in a roar. Flames leapt fast, fed by summer winds, and before anyone could get a bucket, 3 cabins were gone, and the smoke was thick enough to block the sun, but not on the ridge. Up there, the cabins didn't burn. They hissed, smoked. One caught a bit of scorched bark in its rain gutter and steamed for an hour, but the steel, hammered, patched, ugly as sin, didn't catch. People from town ran to her hill not just to help but to watch. Some cried, some knelt. One man, red-eyed and soot-faced, whispered, "We mocked her, and she built the future." After the fire, the mayor came. Not in ceremony, not with banners or with deputies. He came walking alone, hat in hand, boots covered in ash. He didn't ask for warmth. He didn't ask for guidance. He asked for permission to build more down there, the rest of the town. Steel-lined, low-built, like yours. Norah stared at him for a long time, then nodded once. "I'll draw the plans." Fall came early that year. The leaves didn't get their usual gold. They dropped overnight, crisp and brown, and the geese flew south a month ahead of schedule. The second winter didn't come gently. It arrived with a silence that fooled no one. The sun slipped behind grey faster than expected, and the wind began to carry that deep, knowing bite, the kind of cold that didn't just touch skin but found bones, even beneath wool. It whispered of death, not as a threat but as a familiar promise. But this time they were ready. Every cabin on the ridge now stood low and dense, their silhouettes strange from a distance, like armored beetles hunkered against the sky. Their walls, curved and patched, lined with clay and horsehair, shimmered faintly with frost each morning, but the heat inside held. Chimneys puffed in tandem, smoke curled upward in soft, steady plumes. The trench between homes no longer served just as drainage. It became a channel of movement, a lifeline. Children carried hot meals through it in the worst storms. One old man walked it in bare feet to test if it was warm enough to keep using, and it was. In town, things were worse. Those who had resisted the ridge plan were rebuilding too slowly. Some cabins still had gaps. Thin walls, poorly insulated flues. Norah's blueprints had made it to them. But late, winter showed no mercy for delay. The first freeze shattered water buckets inside a mayor's home. A newborn died in a poorly sealed attic room. The doctor rode up to the ridge twice in 1 week just to warm his hands and refill his medicine from what Norah had dried during summer. Willow bark, comfrey, sage root. She gave it freely, but with fewer words each time. Norah's cough had grown. The constant night air, even warmed, had worn something loose in her chest. She ignored it at first, worked through it. She still hauled logs, still patched the windbreak with tar in the sleet, still taught the young ones how to trim stove ash without choking their flues. But by December, her voice was threadbare, and the blue had crept into her nails. One morning, while teaching Maybeth how to twist a grease-soaked rag into a makeshift sealant, Norah swayed slightly and put a hand to the doorframe. Maybeth asked if she was dizzy. "Just remembering something," she whispered, "from the first storm." But the girl knew better. They tried to keep it quiet. Only a few knew. Boone, Jones, the Reverend's son. They rotated shifts by her side, not to watch over her like a patient, but to keep her company, quietly, as she sat in the chair her father had made, her fire stoked low and steady. She still refused help to wash or eat, but she accepted tea now, and let them read to her from books she'd kept wrapped in flannel under the floorboards. When asked why she hadn't let anyone see the books before, she only said, "The words had to sit in me first. Now they can sit with others." They were about shelter, about warmth, about endurance. One was a field manual on heat conservation, dated before the war. One was a volume of old Pueblo construction methods. Another was a tattered school book on physics, half its pages stuck together with pine, resin, but still legible enough to explain why steel curved under pressure but locked in heat like no timber ever could. The last was a Bible, not for preaching, but because the paper burned slow. She never needed to burn it, but she had marked a page long ago. Ecclesiastes. "Two are better than one, for if they fall, one will lift up the other. And a threefold cord is not quickly broken." The winter clawed, but it didn't break them. Not this time. When the food ran low, they pooled it, not because they had to, but because they remembered. Not just the freeze, but the fear. They remembered what it felt like to be shut out, to hear warmth on the other side of a steel wall, and know you hadn't earned it. So they made sure no one felt that again. Each morning, someone left bread by Norah's door. Each night, a child fetched kindling from her trench stack. One boy, scrawny, no older than 7, sat by her vent every Thursday and recited stories from his head. He didn't know she was sleeping most times. But one night she smiled and said, "Keep going." So he did. Then in February, after 37 days of unbroken snow and wind, the pipe cracked, not in her cabin, in the hearth. The central stove chimney had taken damage during the last firewood drop. A young man had slipped, caught his boot in the vent brace, and weakened the weld. They hadn't noticed, not until the heat inside dropped suddenly, and smoke began to linger low. People panicked. The hearth wasn't just a room anymore. It was a symbol. It was where stories were told, where soup was stirred for the sick, where warmth was shared by those who still carried the memories of what came before. They rushed to fix it, but the vent was narrow, and no man's shoulders could fit. They needed someone smaller, a child. They argued, yelled, pointed. No one would risk theirs, until Maybeth stepped forward. "I'll go," she said. She taught me, Norah, too weak now, to stand, sat at the window. When the child passed by, she tapped the glass once. Maybeth turned, pressed her hand to the window, then climbed inside the flue. It took 15 minutes. She tied a rope to her waist, another to her wrist, and pulled herself in with slow, practiced care. The stove was cold now, no danger of heat, but the vent was tight, greasy, steep. The pipe bent sharply, and there was soot everywhere. She choked twice, cried once. Then, in the dark, she found the seam. The weld was split where the elbow joined the main stack, a crack the length of her finger. She took the oiled rag Norah had prepared, rolled tight, soaked in ash and pine gum, and shoved it in, pressed hard. It caught. She wedged her boot against the wall and used her whole arm to grind the patch in until it locked against the inner groove of the pipe. The smoke cleared. The heat rose. The hearth was saved. They carried her out wrapped in blankets. Someone tried to cheer. Another wept. But Maybeth just walked straight to Norah's door and knocked once. "I did it," she said. Inside, the fire cracked softly, and Norah nodded. 3 days later, the frost lifted. The sun returned in earnest. The first geese passed overhead, and the steel cabin, the original, patched and battered and ringed with muddy snow, breathed out steam from its stovepipe like a dragon settling to sleep. She passed quietly that night, not in pain, not alone. Boone found her still upright in her chair, hands wrapped in a shawl, her boots muddy from where she'd stood to check the trench one last time before dark. The coals were still warm, her breath had faded without sound, and on her lap was the blueprint, but not the old one. A new one, smaller cabins, more of them, built in a ring, not a crescent, each with double walls, each with a porthole to the center. At the center, not a stove, a garden. She'd begun planning for spring. They buried her on the ridge, not far from the door. The ground was still hard. It took hours. No one complained. When they were done, the children built a stone ring around the plot. Someone laid her hammer on top. Someone else etched her name into a steel plate. It read, "Norah Bell, who built fire and shared it." In the years to come, the ridge grew. They called it Bell Hollow. Not a town, not a camp, something quieter, something stronger. Every home had steel. Every chimney curled like hers. Every child learned to patch a pipe, bend a vent, and save fire not just for self, but for others. And every winter on the first snowfall, they lit the hearth with her charcoal and told the story of the widow no one believed, until she proved them all wrong, not with words, but with warmth.